This mini Christmas ghost tale takes us to a tenement building on Princes Street in Hull in 1938. The case came before Hull Police Court and the Stipendiary Magistrates Court in December of that year. The defendant was a 37-year-old labourer named Walter Gill, and you may hear the ghost referred to as the Laughing Ghost. On December 4th, 1938, Walter Gill began to be tormented by unsettling noises in the house. These noises included disembodied footsteps, tapping and creepy, non-living laughing. Walter Gill, becoming increasingly distressed, confided in his neighbour George Robert West that the disturbances would send him to an early grave. Unfortunately, Mr. West found Walter Gill a number of days later, with all the gas taps turned on, attempting to unalive himself through the inhalation of coal gas. Mr. Gill did live. Shockingly, unaliving was considered a criminal act in England until 1961, so Mr. Gill would have needed to prove that the real perpetrator of this action had been the spectre. Despite there being other witnesses to these events, Mr. Gill was still sentenced before the courts to 2 years probation, and he admitted himself to an institution. Mr. Gill was sentenced 21st of December 1938. Mr. West also experienced these events. Newspaper reports of court proceedings in December 1938 mention Mr. West testifying that the noises sounded like someone kneading bread in the empty upstairs rooms. When the magistrate questioned whether someone living could be causing the disturbance, he replied, "No, I heard the noise last night, and every time it finishes, somebody starts laughing. It goes on until 1:30 in the morning, and it scares me a bit." Mr. West also mentioned he had bolted the door 2 nights previous, but found at 1 a.m. that the bolt had been snapped off. He attested that someone was trying to get in. He could just see the top of the being's figure. Mr. Gill had confided in Mr. West, "I know what it is. They are digging my grave after midnight." Witnesses also mentioned a ghost at the upper windows of the property, catching a glimpse of its old but smart clothing before it dashed off. Self-murder, or felo de se, or felon of himself, became a crime under common law in England from the mid-13th century, unless the person could be proved to be insane. King Altheston passed a law in the 10th century preventing burials of those self-unalived on consecrated ground. Christian burial was denied, and although more of a local than a national approach, those who had unalived themselves might have been taken and buried at crossroads at night time with a stake hammered through the heart, pinning them to the ground. There were no rites or loved ones in attendance. It was believed that this burial practice would prevent the spirit animating the body post-burial. The crossroads intended that if the spirit did try to rise, it would become directionally confused and unable to find its way home. The stake through the heart was to prevent the spirit returning to threaten those who had buried them in this way. It may also have been considered, wrongly, in self-proclaimed, more moralistic times, to have represented the physical humiliation of deviants. The early Christians incorporated pagan ideas into their practices to ease the conversion to Christianity. Although it may be that this form of burial was reserved for those already on the outer fringes of society, more socially acceptable folk who had unalived themselves would still have been buried on unconsecrated ground in unmarked graves without ceremony or rites, and these burials continued to be performed at night time. The situation was eased in 1823 by Home Secretary Robert Peel when he passed an act allowing burial in a churchyard, but still only at night and without Christian service. This was after the Foreign Secretary, Viscount Castlereagh, unalived himself and was buried at Westminster. A further act in 1882 permitted burial during daylight hours and with the usual religious rites. In 1961, unaliving was decriminalised. Prior to this, churches which had been under local authority rather than religious jurisdiction may have had more caring practices or kept better burial records. Another appalling factor in the care of those who had unalived themselves was that all their possessions would be handed to the Crown. In those times, especially families which had lost a father, they could find themselves reduced to pauperism. I wonder how many were lost around crossroads, society's parameters, and in unhallowed ground in England. How many of us have lost the souls of ancestors who deserve greater care and respect? At this time, I wish these souls peace, and perhaps a seat around your hearth this Christmas, depending on your hospitality.